Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our four panelists for today. First, we have with us Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have with us Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. We also have with us Mr. Andre Wong, who's the General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have with us Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, great having you here with us and looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, recently President Trump created an executive order that created a Religious Liberty Commission. In this commission, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick of Texas has been tapped to chair, and also we have Dr. Ben Carson, who's been tapped to be the vice chair of this particular commission. You know, this was all announced at a National Day of Prayer, and one of the big questions that we were asked is, are we now starting to see more of a question of whether there's still supposed to be a separation of church and state? President Trump may have said tongue-in-cheek that on this day, let's forget about that. But in reality, it begs a bigger question. The bigger question that we have to deal with is more and more political leaders are now acting as though the concept of the separation of church and state may be passé or may not be constitutional. You know, Todd, when I start to take a look at this, and then even when I start to take a look of who the leadership group for this commission may be, I have to ask myself the question, where do we start to infringe upon the Establishment Clause? Or when are we just simply trying to do something that's better in the name of religion? Or is that even something the government should be involved in?
Well, Orlin, first of all, the creation of a Commission on Religious Liberty does not, I think, by any measure violate the Establishment Clause, nor do I think attending a prayer breakfast. Now, what happens in this Religious Liberty Commission could, but the mere creation of itself does not. The list is interesting, of course. Some of the individuals I does not wear that Dr. Phil had a background in religious liberty, but you know, it's always good to have more people on the team to work on these issues. So we'll have to see what this commission does and what it pushes, but I don't think that the mere creation of it should raise any concerns by itself.
I tend to agree with Todd on this, which is maybe shocking to him, but it is true, I think, that, you know, if the president wants to use his executive authority to establish a commission that is concerned with one of the most important constitutional rights that we have, then to me, that's fine and dandy. What it is in principle, I don't think is a problem. In practice, however, I have a very hard time trusting anything that Donald Trump does along the lines of religious liberty, because I don't really think he's concerned about religious liberty. I think he's very shrewd politically, and given some of the people who he's installed as the leadership, these are hyper partisan people who are Trump loyalists. And again, I don't want to get into the muck and mire of politics and mudslinging, but I just have a hard time believing that religious freedom means anything to the people in the leadership other than a partisan view that Christians are under attack and we have to do everything we can to protect them. Again, in principle, nothing wrong with what the president did. In practice, I'm taking a wait and see approach, and I suspect we won't have to wait that long to see that some of these practices may be in direct contravention to the separation of church and state. But in principle, no.
Orla, I just want to say that a shiver went down my spine at the beginning of this episode. Todd and Tim agreeing right out of the gate could mean that the apocalypse is actually upon us, and we just need to look for the other signs right now. I'm going to sort of say I'm somewhat in the middle between Todd and Tim on this. The people that I know that are on the commission, and I don't know everybody, is I don't know Dr. Phil, but I know about 5 of the people that are on the commission, and they're all serious. They're good. I mean, Dr. Ryan Anderson is a serious guy with a good view of religious liberty. Rabbi Meir Soloveichik, who is an Orthodox Jew, one of the leading Orthodox rabbis in the world. His father actually is a legendary rabbi. One, he's not a Christian, and 2, he's got a really great view of religious liberty. I've known him for years, and he's great. So the way these commissions tend to operate is they tend to kind of try to reach consensus and issue reports. They don't tend to have a real policymaking capacity. I think in this administration, the best forecast would be this commission will issue some reports on policy and culture. They'll probably be driven by the people on the committee who know the most about these things. And the people that I know that are on the committee do know a lot about these things and are serious. There are people on the commission that I wish weren't. I'm not a fan of, Paula White, for instance, but she is in President Trump's inner circle on faith. And, again, Dr. Phil, I have no idea. But sometimes, if you want to publicize the serious work of serious people, you need people that are better on the publicity side. And it's pretty clear Dr. Phil is good at that. So if he can lend his celebrity to more people understanding religious liberty the way Dr. Ryan Anderson and Mayor Soloveichik and Todd McFarlane understand it, I think that would be a good thing.
Andre, what's interesting is that when you juxtapose this against the idea of some other executive orders that the president has engaged in, for example, the anti-Christian bias activities, the question is this pushing in the direction where some have been talking about, America really is birthed as a religious nation. It's based on Christianity, and therefore this is part of the next steps on how we, quote unquote, bring it back into alignment. Do you get any sense of that as you see this commission?
Well, that phraseology is actually in the executive order creating the commission. It says that it's created to vigorously enforce the historic and robust protections of religious liberty enshrined in federal law. So yeah, I mean, it sounds good, but let me address the elephant in the room, perhaps the political elephant and the metaphorical elephant, and that is Trump sees religious conservatives as the base of his political success, and so really the creation of this commission, while well intended, is about optics. Trump said at his press conference creating the commission, I don't know if there's really a separation between church and state, but we're bringing back religion in our country in a big way. And he's said straight up, we're taking executive actions to root out anti-Christian bias in government. So when you have Paula White, who is, the senior advisor in the White House for the Office of Faith, prayer is not a religious act. It is a national necessity. I think that gives us an indication of the direction and tone of the commission.
And it disturbs me. And to Tim Schultz's point, I have no doubt that a lot of the people involved with this commission are good people. Are good, knowledgeable, competent people who care about religious freedom and who want to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. I'm just not so sure that the person spearheading this effort, who wrote the executive order and signed it, has that kind of good faith and has that kind of goodwill. I always hate to see, and years ago this happened during the first term of the Bush administration. There was somebody from the University of Pennsylvania who was called down to DC and made a part of the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives at the White House. And after not too long, he ended up leaving. And when he left, he said, these people don't care about faith-based organizations. All they care about is politics. And he said, I can't operate under those kinds of conditions. So I hate to see good people pulled in and used as political pawns just so that the president can continue to score points with his political base. I take religious freedom seriously. I have no doubt that a lot of the people involved with the commission do as well. But I have serious doubts about the president's lack of good faith, and I think those doubts are justified.
I was just going to say that was Professor John DiIulio, by the way.
Oh, that's right. Thank you, Tim.
Remains, one of the leading lights of the role of religion in society. I'm sorry, Orlin, I'll let you get to Todd, but I just want to say, yeah, I think the jury's out on this. I think, though, that if you're a person asked to be on that commission, I think it raises a question, right? Like, if you're asked to be on a commission like that by the president, would you do it? Or would you say, well, I mistrust your morals and your intentions, and so I'm not going to, And I think it may be that some of the people on a committee like that will see that it is in the end just political. And if they do, I think a lot of them, ones I know at least, probably would have the integrity to resign in the very same way that Professor DiIulio did.
Yeah, but Todd, I got to ask the question. I mean, the idea of you've got a position that's politically appointed and somehow it's not supposed to have a political taint to it. It almost seems like you're trying to take the politics out of politics. I mean, isn't this part and parcel of what's going on? These commissions are about optics, to some degree about policy, but it's always going to be probably a combination of all of the above?
Yeah, I don't know the professor that, that withdrew and what his expectations were, but it sounds like a person who just didn't really understand how DC works more than anything. There's no administration that's going to be able to put one of these together that can accomplish something without looking at the political aspects to it. And to some extent, you want that, right? Politics is ultimately simply reflecting what the electoral situation is, and people want to get it reelected, which we generally consider to be, what we want our elected representatives to do. Now, that doesn't mean that politics can't get in the way of things, but expecting to be able to accomplish something in D.C. without looking at the political angle of it is really beyond naive. Again, most of these commissions, quite frankly, end up, 4 years from now or whenever, when you look back at it, have they accomplished a lot? Sometimes, a lot of times not. I don't want to, speak ill of this before it's even gotten started. But before we start saying this is going to really infringe on, interfere with the Establishment Clause and people's rights, that presupposes that they actually, move the ball forward in any meaningful way. And we'll see if that happens.
I'm wondering if Paula White is going to be earnestly concerned about the religious freedom of American Buddhists, Hindus, and American Muslims. I suspect that she might go off in prayer, in scare quotes, and come back and say, the Lord has told me X, Y, and Z, which is another problem. Listen, when religion and politics come together, sometimes epistemology or truth runs up against a speculative metaphysics that says, God told me to do this and God wants the commission to go this way. And the other people on the commission are sitting there saying, what are you talking about? If we're going to have religion and politics work together in the interest of a sound public policy, at some point, our metaphysical commitments need to recede in the interest of working together with other people to truly do the right thing. If we're going to have religious belief directed discussion, then that to me is a non-starter, because you're never going to get people from different traditions and faiths to agree on those things. So I think we have to be careful and ask ourselves exactly what is this about? If it's about getting people to work together, that's great. If it's about Christians claiming that this is their opportunity to shine, probably not so much.
Well, Tim, I'm going to let that be the last word, but I think that's the real question. Whenever you have politics or politicians talking about religious issues and really putting together a commission to delve into those issues, the likelihood is that we're probably never going to get everybody on the same page. And I think it's impossible to take the politics out of politics. There's an interesting case called St. Joseph Parish versus Nessel. And it's a case regarding a Catholic parish and also a specific school that exists in St. John's, Michigan. This is an institution that's been around, is considered to be a top-notch elementary school, and it exists as most faith institutions from an academic standpoint to kind of push along the faith to the next generation. But what we have here is a situation where, like many Catholic parishes, its academic institutions require all of its staff to uphold its Catholic teachings in word and in deed. But sometimes there are issues as it relates to gender and marriage and sexuality that may be in violation of an action somebody engages in, and as a result thereof, the Catholic operation or its church or its institutions may decide that they don't want to abide by it. You know, recently, Michigan actually put in place a law that threatens to make it illegal for St. Joseph to ensure that its school rules and those who serve in its parish communities uphold their religious beliefs. And the Supreme Court decision reinterpreted state civil rights statutes definition of sex to now include sexual orientation and without any exemptions for religious organizations like St. Joseph. You know, Andre, when I take a look at some of these cases that are happening, on one hand, you have the Supreme Court making decisions. On the other hand, you have local state legislatures and state courts that seem to be nibbling around the edges. And this looks to be like one of those cases as well. How do we try to figure out to juxtapose what's going on in the state, what's going on in the Supreme Court? And then when they overlap, it seems like there's more confusion as opposed to any clarity.
Right. And just for clarification, in this case, is the Michigan Supreme Court that interpreted the state civil rights statutes definition of sex to include sexual orientation without any religious exemption for organizations like St. Joseph. So in 2023, the Michigan legislature then codified that to expand their civil rights law to expressly prohibit discrimination either based because of sexual orientation or gender identity. The Michigan's redefinition of discrimination does threaten religious organizations' right to create and maintain its religious and school environment that reflects their faith, and in this case, St. Joseph's Catholic faith. The First Amendment of the Constitution protects the right of religious groups, including schools and churches, to operate in accordance with the religious mission. So, so I think that the U.S. Supreme Court's holding in Our Lady of Guadalupe case, where in that case the court did hold that religious institutions have the freedom to make internal decisions in its operation, or should be free from government interference. So I think that religious communities do have that right, and I think that ultimately the St. Joseph's Parish will prevail.
You know, Tim Schultz, when I look at these type of cases, and on one hand, people say, well, the Supreme Court seems like they've been pretty clear on this, but in the same breath, we still have states that are moving and doing different things. And I guess we'll just find ourselves finding this regular route of cases going up to Supreme Court for reinterpretation? Or is this something where, the idea of religious institutions at the academic level are simply allowed to do what many would say their charter is to pass their religious beliefs on from one generation to the next?
Well, there's sort of two things at work here. One of them is this, as Andre already talked about, there's this line of cases at the Supreme Court, beginning in the Hosanna Tabor case, that said that there is a constitutional right to choose who teaches your religion. It's sometimes referred to in law as the ministerial exception. The courts are not unanimous about what kinds of employees fall under that ministerial exception. Now, that's a constitutional right, so that would supersede any non-discrimination statute at the state or federal level because the Constitution applies universally across the board. But I think right now the courts have seen that as a case-by-case thing. If you teach religion, you're clearly a ministerial employee. If you're the math teacher, though, right now the courts aren't clear. I personally think religious groups have a right to infuse their mission throughout every single square inch of their institutions and ought to be left alone to make those determinations. But the courts aren't totally there yet. The other thing that's in play here is I think it's always best to have these things defined in statute. There was an opportunity, before we ever heard of the so-called fairness for all approach to LGBT non-discrimination versus religious freedom. The state speaker of the House of Michigan, who was a Republican, brought forward in 2013 a proposal to do both things at the same time. At the time, he was rejected mostly by his own party on that question. But I think looking back, I think people would say, wow, if he had had his way, Michigan would have had the kinds of protections for LGBT people that it now has, but it also would have had statutory, more explicit and obvious rights for religious institutions like this Catholic school. So there's lots happening here. I'd love to hear what the other panelists have to say.
Yeah, I think that at some point, left-wing extremist political ideology has to give way to the fundamental right to religious freedom. I speak as someone who was born and raised Catholic, grew up in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. I went to the school for the Church of the Immaculate Conception. And so as someone who came from one of these communities, I have to tell you that it's sad to see that political ideology has taken such a hold of the Michigan state legislature that they wouldn't inscribe the exception for the parish in the statute. Mm-hmm. I mean, we shouldn't even have to go through litigation. I'm guessing that the best outcome of this litigation, or one of the things that would make this litigation a good thing, would be that the legislature would be told that you have to grant the exception, right? That you can't do this, you can't infringe upon the religious freedom of an organization in this way. So it's sad to see that political ideology is so strong that it has a hold of state legislators, and that it wouldn't allow them to grant this exception in the first place, because if they had granted the exception in the first place, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I think that's sad.
It is true that, legislatures have become more hostile. So, for instance, when California passed their law, the FEHA, Fair Employment Housing Act, back in, I think, in the 1970s or 80s, it gave a complete exemption to religion. And this was in, that deeply red state of California, right? This was in a progressive state that was taking on some of the earliest protections in these areas, but they seem to understand that religious organizations need this exemption. And that is gone. And it's because these they talk about it in terms of protecting employees, but I think what's really motivating this is a desire to simply change the culture and to use the law to try to change these religious organizations' views on this, and say, listen, you can hold this theology maybe, but you can't practice it. And we see the courts taking the lead on this. So, in Michigan, you had the Supreme Court and then the legislature kick in. And in Maryland, you saw, again, the Maryland Supreme Court recently constrained its religious exemption on its own, essentially rewrote the statute. And of course, the state that got this all kicking off was Washington State, which, Tim, you've got, you're in the background there. And that was where, again, in Woods versus Seattle Union Gospel Mission, the Supreme Court just rewrote the exemption that was in there. So the legislature had given exemption in Washington, and the Washington Supreme Court said, nope, we're going to narrow this. And eventually this issue is going to get up to the U.S. Supreme Court. I think the odds of it are pretty good for the religious organizations, but it's a fight that shouldn't need to exist.
Andrew, what I don't understand is it seems as though in particular the business many of us are in is the idea is society gets to do what it needs to do, but there should be some exemptions that are created or waivers that are created or just things that are put in place for other organizations. It seems as though we are getting into what I would call a no tolerance zone for exemptions under any circumstances. And most of it, I wonder, are people even really understanding what churches and religious organizations are asking for? Or is it just simply, know it, no outs, nobody gets free, this is how it's going to be?
Yeah, and it goes to I think it goes to Dr. Golden's point about how polarized our two partisan sides are, and I mean there is certainly a view on the left that this is just religion, just wanting to bulldoze its way through society, impose its views on all of us, and therefore we need to reel back, because it's done in the name of we have an exemption to do this and the freedom to do that. I mean there has to be a balance, not only politically and legislatively, but also culturally. I mean, I think we really need to step back and re-examine the proper role of religion and how it acts in our society and in our schools and in our private sector.
I'm going to let that be the last word, but I think what we're really talking about is if religious groups would start to use their religious beliefs more as a shield instead of a sword, maybe we'd find ourselves having a lot less of these type of battles. Hey, Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
Justice Amy Coney Barrett is emerging as a stabilizing force in these politically charged times on the court, and she will move more toward the progressive side and resist some of the radical conservative views of her fellow justices. She will be Justice Sandra Day O'Connor 2.0.
Wow. Andre Wong, tell me something I don't know.
Dr. Ben Carson, the vice chair of the Religious Liberty Commission, has a public high school named after him in Detroit, Michigan. And Dr. Carson also holds 38 honorary doctorate degrees.
Wow. Todd, tell me something I don't know.
The plaintiff in the case I referred to earlier, Woods versus Seattle Union Gospel Mission, ended up voluntarily dropping his case rather than take it to trial, rather than let a jury decide whether he'd been discriminated against, largely likely because he was afraid of appellate review.
Didn't know that. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Orland, we talked about the ministerial exception inherent in the First Amendment earlier in the episode. The current leading Court of Appeals case with the broadest construction of that particular protection comes out of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is probably now the most progressive circuit in the country. So I think the ministerial exception is trending in the direction that all of us would favor, and I expect the Supreme Court to ultimately ratify the rights of the ministerial exception in about the broadest way possible.
Wow, that's a lot. Gentlemen, really appreciate our conversation today. Hope we get a chance to do it again soon. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.